A Guten Erev Shabbos. Listen to a fascinating medrash about Jewish power and speaking to temporal authority. It's from Medrash Tanchuma, and the story is of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the prince, talking to the emperor Antoninus. Antoninus was one of the good emperors who ruled over a period of peace in the Roman Empire a little over 2,000 years ago. According to some, Antoninus was none other than Marcus Aurelius. According to Wikipedia, he was Marcus Aurelius's adoptive father and predecessor as emperor. Antoninus, this emperor, once traveled to Caesarea in Israel, and when he arrived, he asked that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the great leader of Rabbinic Judaism, appear before him. Rabbi Yehuda set out for the meeting, with his son Rabbi Shimon and his colleague Rabbi Chia in tow. As they neared the emperor's entourage, Rabbi Shimon commented on the impressive stature and shape of the Roman soldiers. Rabbi Chia was not impressed, and he told Rabbi Shimon to come with him to the market, where Rabbi Chia pointed out a pile of grapes for sale that had a cloud of flies hovering over them. "You see those flies, Rabbi Chia?" asked Rabbi Shimon. "Those soldiers of the emperor back there are no more significant than those flies." Then the two went back to the meeting, and Rabbi Shimon told his father what Rabbi Yehuda had said. Rabbi Yehuda, when he heard about this exchange, was even more dismissive of the soldiers. He said, "Rabbi Chia said they were the same as the flies. They're worth less than the flies. God used bugs to punish the Egyptians in the 10 plagues, and Isaiah talked about flies clearing the way of the enemy so the Jews can enter the land of Israel. But those soldiers amount to nothing at all." All this is to say that whatever God chooses as his emissary or channel to carry out his will, don't be so impressed by physical statures. Joseph, in our story this week, and in the final 4 parshias of the book of Genesis, of Vayeishev, is the most despised of all the brothers. Yet, the redemption of Egypt unfolds on his account. Thinking back to God's conversation with Abraham, with Avram, a few parshas ago, and the covenant of the parts, Jacob's descendants were destined to journey to a foreign land and endure slavery and bondage there for 400 years before going out with great wealth. That descent began with the sibling rivalry among Joseph and his brothers, continued with them first plotting fratricide, eventually relenting just to sell him into slavery. He then rose from servitude to viceroy of Egypt, ultimately rescuer and forgiver of his brothers. It seems to us, and it probably seemed to them, that the brothers were just acting on their own emotions and feelings when they allowed their jealousy and resentment of Joseph's most favored son status to get the best of them. They plotted to harm him, but what was really happening was the divine plan unfolding. We who read the sequence of events thousands of years later see the grander scope of the plan. Yet the wisdom is in seeing how these things unfold in real time. As the Midrash concludes with a quote from Psalm 92, "How great are your works of God, how deep are your thoughts. Ma gadol ma'asecha Hashem, ma'od amku machshavaisecha." The Pri Tzaddik by Rav Tzadok of Lublin points out that this Midrash and our story at hand brings us to the conversation of that ever perplexing question of free will and divine providence. Again, on the face of it, if we read the strife between brothers, Joseph and his brothers, as emanating from their own personal animosities and insecurities, it's one thing. Their father seems to show favor to one child over the rest. That favor eventually goes to the head of the favorite child. Of course, there's more than that underlying the story, which is why the Tanchuma highlights this dynamic, using the story of the Roman emperor and the little squad of rabbis spinning examples at each other in the marketplace of Caesarea. When you view it all through a spiritual lens, the flies in the marketplace simply move and act according to instinct at a chemical level. They just respond to stimuli and swarm around the sweets. The soldiers, for all their muscle and bluster, have free will, and yet that free will, even its cruelty and wickedness, is deployed at the right time and the right place for whatever purpose is in the divine plan. That's Reb Tzadok's explanation, that even less faithful servants of God than the flies are they, the soldiers. In this light, it's been the work of many commentators to try and figure out why exactly the Egyptian nation and its ruler, the Pharaoh of the day, were punished so harshly and severely for simply carrying out what seemed to be their lot, subjugation and enslavement of the Jewish people. If, in fact, those Egyptians are just tools in God's hand, then why would it be their liability? It would bring them such suffering, such punishment, as we'll read about in weeks to come with the 10 plagues. So there is free will, and then there's free will, it seems. The Egyptians were there to be part of the promise made to Abraham, that his descendants would be exiled to a land not theirs and would endure slavery. That's what it was supposed to be. Although we can ask, did it need to be Egypt, or would any land have done just as well? In any case, let's say the Egyptians were meant to be the enslavers. But the enjoyment, the geschmack, the dedication with which they set themselves to making the Israelites miserable, that was the cause of their just deserts. They were the enslavers, yes, but they were enthusiastic. They got into it. They took such pleasure, put their whole selves into it. And for that, they were held culpable. That's why the plagues, up to and including the firstborn. That degree of emotional involvement, which is a nice term for rishus, wickedness, was entirely and completely up to them. Now, to be even-handed, let's apply the same standards to the Shvatim, the brothers of Joseph, who sold him into slavery. It's true, the house of Jacob was destined to be exiled, captive, and then enslaved, apparently in Egypt. This was explicit and implicit in God's covenant with Abraham. So how much of the brothers' actions was beyond the minimum required? In other words, for how much are they ultimately culpable? Did they have to treat Joseph so horribly? That phrase at the beginning that jumps out at us each year and resonates across the ages, Lo yachlu dabro l'shalom. They could not speak peaceably to their brother Joseph. They ostracized him. They resented him. They basically gave him the silent treatment. Was that necessary? They abducted him, threw him into a pit with snakes and scorpions. Necessary? They plotted amongst themselves to kill him until more merciful heads prevailed. Was that preordained? Or was that their emotions getting the better of them, even for the moment? And while we're examining all the figures in the story, let's not ignore Joseph himself, Yosef HaTzadik. He's called the righteous. So righteous, the Torah tells us he brought poor reports about his brothers to their father. Well, no one likes a tattletale, and we actually have a mitzvah not to be a bearer of tales amongst our people, not to gossip. The Midrash reports that Yosef brought accusations to their father, that the brothers were eating treif, living immorally, worst of all, harassing each other. They were bothering the brothers, teasing the brothers who were the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, the handmaidens of Leah and Rachel. Well, was he defending those brothers or accusing those brothers? The Torah uses the phrase dibas amara to describe Joseph's speech. Rashi says it just means speech. Ramban, Nachmanides, argues that it really means malicious speech. It's intended to wound. In the ambiguity between these two commentaries, we sense the ambiguity in Yosef's speech itself. We know he was a clever guy. So perhaps as a youthful, self-assured 17-year-old who already knew he was his father's favorite, he made careful use of this ambiguity. He could have kept the reports to himself. He also could have voiced them in a way that was not only non-judgmental, but closed that loop of ambiguity. So it was clear to their father that he meant no malice. Even in the subtle leaving open of the possibility for misinterpretation, Rashi suggests that all the trials he had coming to him later in life, as the story unfolds, were his comeuppance for his reports that were a little too clever by half. Where's the place for free will in life, especially in situations like these? Rav Tzadok says we don't know. We have a godly soul in us, and we have our own drives and desires. You can't say with full knowledge where the divine stops and the mundane, the human, begins. The Yetzer, that we often speak about a little bit elliptically, creates temptations to follow sometimes our baser drives, and with that brings about free will. If there's only one choice, that's not really a choice. Anybody who lives in a town with only one kosher pizza place will tell you that. The challenge, therefore, lies with us to do our very best to see through the screen of competing agendas and choose the good. That's hard. So we have recourse to tshuva, to learn from our miscalculations and lapses and resolve to do better the next time around. If we fail, we keep doing tshuva. Bonus insight, when we succeed, we can also do tshuva. Anyone with half a clue knows you have to learn from your mistakes. It's next level to know that you have to learn from your successes also. Also, the better to be prepared for what comes next time around. Yet, if we ignore all the possibilities that are laid before us, we are then held fully accountable for our failures to do this. Our feelings are not predetermined. Viktor Frankl pointed that out. Although sometimes this is the only element of free choice left to us, to choose the frame of mind and the attitude with which we will meet whatever is headed our way. That choice is nevertheless a full and inalienable choice. Rav Tzadok adds that this explains the great emphasis Torah places on Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. Shabbos, you have to keep. Matzah, we have to eat at the Seder. The menorah, we're going to light this coming week. That's not up to us. What is up to us, whether we see all that as a chore, an obligation, something that takes time away from what we really want to be doing. Or is that life, chayenu, v'orech yamenu, it's our light, the length of our days. This is exactly what we want to be doing and what we're looking forward to as the fullest and deepest expression of ourselves. So this, living as a Jew, gives us our fullest and most complete joy and happiness. Speaking of Joseph's being traduced by his brothers and sold into slavery, landing up in prison by the end of the Parsha, the 19th and 20th of Kislev mark the anniversary of the release from prison of Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, the Baal HaTanya, in 1798. Now, what was a rabbi doing in prison, you ask? Well, in those days, Russia was at war with Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and if you recall your history, the land of Israel was under Turkish rule for centuries, including those days. So anyone giving material aid to the enemy was a traitor to the Tsar. But Jews in the Russian Empire wanted to send money to support the small, poor Jewish settlements in Israel, despite the ban. Rabbi Shner Zalman's detractors denounced him to the Tsar's police, saying that he was an anti-monarchist, he was a revolutionary against the king, and they proved it by evidence of him sending money to Israel. He was arrested in Tishrei of that year on a capital charge, was held for 53 days in a prison cell in the Petropavlovsk fortress in St. Petersburg. The government investigated the charges, found them to be false, so the good rabbi was cleared of all the accusations. On the 19th of Kislev, he was released, and then the police delivered him to the wrong address, where he wound up in the home of a bitter opponent, listening to an hours-long harangue against his work. It was sunset until he was able to extricate himself from that situation. So the 2 days, the 19th and the 20th of Kislev, are both marked as his release from captivity. The story of our people keeps coming around to that fateful point again and again. Lo yachlu dabro l'shalom. They could not speak peaceably among the brothers. Our unwillingness to speak gently to and about and with our brothers and sisters continues to bring us grief, even to this very day. Maybe seeing the dark sides of history repeated over and over will encourage us to seek ways to break the chain and move on to better days. A good Shabbos and a happy Hanukkah.